You ever see a company that's just on top of the world? I mean, completely invincible, and then boom, they collapse. It happens all the time, right? A corporate titan just implodes and everyone's left scratching their heads, asking, how did that happen? Well, today we're going to peel back the layers on that exact mystery, because it turns out there's a surprisingly predictable pattern behind these epic falls. So that quote, that was from the former CEO of Nokia. Yeah, Nokia, the company that used to absolutely own the cell phone market. And what a weird thing to say, right? We didn't do anything wrong, but somehow we lost. I mean, that just perfectly captures the total confusion of a leader watching his empire completely crumble. And it sets the stage for what we're talking about today. Because the answer isn't just about a bad product or a missed opportunity. No, it's way deeper than that. It's about a psychological trap that can snare even the most successful leaders. What's wild is that this pattern is so consistent, so predictable, that researchers have started looking at it, well, less like a business problem and more like a medical diagnosis. It's almost like there's an illness you can catch from having too much power, from being too successful, a condition that just clouds your judgment and leads these brilliant people to make absolutely catastrophic mistakes. And at the very heart of this sickness is one word: hubris. Now, we're not just talking about being a little arrogant or cocky. The clinical definition is way more specific. It's a deep, profound overestimation of your own abilities, and, this is the key part, it's triggered by gaining a ton of power. It's that tipping point where healthy self-belief morphs into this dangerous blinder that completely shields you from reality. Okay, and this is where it gets super interesting. Experts now talk about something called Hubris Syndrome, and they call it an acquired disorder. That word acquired is so important here. It means it's not something you're born with. It's not just a personality flaw. It's a change in behavior that happens after someone becomes massively successful. Power can literally change the way a leader's brain works. And just like any other syndrome, it comes with a checklist of symptoms. So what does this syndrome actually look like in the real world? Well, researchers have pinpointed 4 key symptoms. First, leaders with it develop a real contempt for advice. They just dismiss critics, shut down anyone who questions them. Second, they lose touch with reality, with the day-to-day nuts and bolts of their own business. Third, they get obsessed with their image, focusing way more on how things look than on how they actually are. And finally, they start to completely identify with the company. They think, I am the company, which means their personal interests and the company's interests become dangerously blurred. Sound familiar at all? Let's dive into some real-world examples. All right, let's begin our first corporate postmortem. We're going to look at the companies that just flat out refuse to see the future. I mean, these are the giants who literally had the next big thing delivered right to their doorstep, and they basically just slammed the door in its face. Check this out. Back in the year 2000, this tiny, struggling startup called Netflix, you may have heard of them, they offered to sell their whole operation to the undisputed king of video rentals, Blockbuster. And the price? A measly $50 million. The execs at Blockbuster didn't just say no, they reportedly laughed them right out of the room. It has to be one of the single biggest blunders in business history. So you gotta ask, why? Why on earth did they say no? One word: hubris. The leadership at Blockbuster was just so convinced that the experience of going to their store, walking the aisles, picking up that plastic case, was some kind of untouchable advantage. They thought technology could never replace it. They saw their business model as totally invincible. And because of that, they were blind to the massive shift in how people wanted to watch movies that was happening right under their noses. Now, if Blockbuster's fall was a shock, what happened to Kodak was a full-blown earthquake. I mean, look at this. In the 90s, they had a 90% share of the film market in the US. A Kodak moment wasn't just a marketing slogan, it was part of the culture. And yet by 2012, they filed for bankruptcy. And the craziest part? They weren't beaten by a competitor who out-innovated them. No, Kodak was beaten by itself. They invented the future and then did everything they could to bury it. Get this, the very first digital camera, it was invented inside a Kodak lab way back in 1975 by an engineer named Steve Sasson. And when he showed it to management, you know what they said? That's cute, but don't tell anyone about it. They were so scared that this filmless photography would destroy their massive profits from film that they just hid it. This is a textbook symptom of hubris. You're so protective of your current success that you become unable to embrace the future, even when you're the one who invented it. Okay, our next case study, Nokia, is a little different. It's more complex. It shows us that this kind of failure isn't always born from pure arrogance. Sometimes, it's actually born from a toxic culture of fear. So what really took down the king of mobile phones? It's so easy to just chalk it up to the same kind of overconfidence we saw with Blockbuster and Kodak, but when you look at the research from inside the company during its final years, a really shocking and different picture emerges. It turns out the problem started at the very top, Nokia's senior leadership. They were terrified. They were scared of Apple. They were scared of missing their quarterly numbers. They were scared of losing their spot at the top. And all that fear from the outside created this intense, high-pressure environment on the inside. And here's the kicker. That external fear morphed into internal terror. The top bosses were known to be, and I quote, extremely temperamental. They'd just scream at anyone who delivered bad news. So what happened? It created a culture where the middle managers were simply too afraid to tell the truth. They knew their operating system was a mess compared to the competition, but they were too scared to say so. Instead, they would sugarcoat reports, they'd promise things they couldn't deliver, and sometimes the research shows they just straight up lied to their bosses to keep their jobs. The entire company was paralyzed by fear. So when we take a step back and look at all these stories together, you've got Blockbuster's denial, Kodak's self-sabotage, Nokia's internal fear, you start to see this universal pattern taking shape. It's a cycle, really. And it's one that people have recognized since the time of the ancient Greeks. See, in Greek mythology, you had this goddess named Nemesis. Her whole job was to deliver payback to any mortals who got a little too full of themselves, who showed too much hubris. In the business world, Nemesis isn't a goddess, but the effect is the same. Nemesis is the market. It's that inevitable, unstoppable force, a new technology, a change in what customers want, a hungry new competitor that comes along and restores balance when a company gets way too overconfident. And this cycle is so darn predictable that the researcher Jim Collins actually mapped it out into 5 clear stages. It all starts with stage 1, hubris born of success. Then that leads to stage 2, the undisciplined pursuit of more. And that's what sets them up for the really critical moment, stage 3, denial of risk and peril. From there, it's a downward spiral into stage 4, grasping for salvation, and then finally, the end of the line, stage 5, capitulation to irrelevance or death. Let's zoom in on that third stage for a second, denial. This is the real point of no return. It's when all the warning lights on the dashboard are flashing bright red, but the people in charge just refuse to look. They start explaining away bad numbers, blaming everything and everyone else for their problems. They put a positive spin on absolutely everything. Sound familiar? Think of Blockbuster, just insisting that their stores were everything, or Kodak, calling the digital camera a cute little toy, or the leadership at Nokia, who only heard the good news they wanted to hear because they scared everyone else into silence. They were all stuck deep in stage 3. And that brings us to a final, pretty mind-bending thought. Every single one of these collapses, they didn't start with failure. They started with massive, overwhelming success. Success is the very thing that plants the seeds of hubris. So that leaves us with the ultimate leadership paradox, doesn't it? If the thing you're fighting so hard to achieve is also the potential trigger for your own downfall, how do you handle it? How do leaders and whole companies stay both successful and humble? That's the question they have to wake up and answer every single day.